The goal of our research with Sway is to create environments where the most polarizing topics can be discussed and debated on campus, but with guardrails that promote understanding and rationality rather than hostility and even more polarization. After the demo, we'll tell you about our experimental studies, but just to frame what you're about to see, here's some feedback from participants who have used Sway. For each quote, the discussion topic is listed first, and in each case, the user chatted with someone they strongly disagreed with about the topic.
This is probably the only way I would ever have a conversation like this. I really appreciated Guide. The fact that it was mediated helped the tone to stay civil and moved the conversation along.
I feel like this is the best AI-driven anything that I've ever personally experienced. It asked very thoughtful, relevant, specific questions to direct the conversation. It was patient, encouraging, and respectful.
It was actually amazing. Guide interjected at the right times without being overly intrusive. I went in thinking that I couldn't compromise, but I left with a more open-minded view. I really enjoyed it.
In a way, I felt safe with Guide. I'm sensitive, so having that slight security with the Guide, I felt better to speak my mind a little more.
This is pretty amazing, right? You might have expected that discussions between partisans on, say, the 2020 election would have gone quite badly, but that's actually not what we see. For this demo, I'm going to show you a Sway discussion between me and Simon, where we role-play on opposite sides of this debate. To clarify, the messages sent by the characters Nick and Simon in this demo were constructed purely for illustrative purposes and should not be interpreted as reflecting our actual views. Normally, a user of Sway would only see their own window, but for this demonstration, I'll show you Simon's perspective on the left side of the screen and my perspective on the right side. Every chat starts with a guide introduction that says, "Hello, users," and announces the topic, in this case, Israel-Palestine, and more specifically, the topic of debate, which is that the U.S. should prioritize Palestinian rights. And in this conversation, we're having Nick agree with the statement and Simon disagree with the statement. So let's start by having Simon say, "Hey, Nick," and let's have Nick say, "Hi, Simon." And let's have Nick start off by coming in really hot. So Nick's going to start just by saying, "So why do you support the Zionist genocide in Gaza?" Really not the best way to start this conversation. It's quite accusatory. It's presuming that Simon supports a genocide. Sway's AI has detected that this message could be improved. So at this point, Nick's going to get a suggestion. Do you support the existence of Israel? If so, how do you justify the deaths of so many innocent women and children in Gaza? Definitely a lot better, less accusatory, more potentially productive. But if Nick doesn't like this rephrase, then he can just refresh it and get another one. Do you endorse the deaths of innocent Palestinians in Gaza as a result of Israeli military actions? Let's have Nick accept that one. Okay. Now Simon's going to respond, "Well, I support Zionism, but I don't believe it is Zionism that's responsible for the conflict." So at every part of the conversation, Guide's in the background trying to decide whether or not to come in, and if so, how to come in. At this point, Guide says, "Nick, I appreciate you jumping into the discussion," and rightfully notes that there's an even more constructive way of beginning the conversation by, instead of assuming something about Simon, asking a question instead. "Simon, could you elaborate on your view of Zionism and explain why you don't believe it's responsible for the conflict?" Simon says, "I don't support everything the Israeli government does. For me, Zionism is just the idea that there should be a Jewish state in Israel." Now, Nick comes in, "But how could you support that when Israel has been so violent and so oppressive? Are you watching the news?" So this is a rather confrontational message to send, but not quite at the level where we need to rephrase it. But now Simon is getting quite upset. Maybe if the Palestinians stopped attacking innocent Israelis, there could finally be peace. Ever think of that? And then with an eye roll emoji. Like Nick's message from before, this is not the most productive way to proceed with a conversation. So at this point, Simon is now presented with a suggestion. Let's see. "Peace between Israelis and Palestinians will only be possible if the Palestinians stop targeting Israeli civilians. It's important to address this root issue." A much better way of saying what Simon was trying to express. But when you get a suggestion, you don't have to accept it. So in this case, let's actually reject it. When a user rejects a message, that's going to bring Guide in. Guide can tell that things are getting a little bit off the rails here. So Guide says, Nick, I understand you feel very strongly. Could you explain more specifically what aspects of Israel's actions you find most concerning and how you believe these relate to the concept of Zionism that Simon mentioned? Guide also says to Simon, thanks for clarifying your view on Zionism, but let's avoid sarcasm and dismissiveness. And Simon says, Nick, I'd like to know your answer. Now, let's have Nick come in quite hot, and this time even hotter than before. Are you kidding me? Are you a moron? Maybe they should drop some 2,000-pound bombs on your family and see how you like it. This message was just outright blocked. There really aren't any redeeming qualities to that message. It insinuates that Simon's a moron, suggests that maybe Simon's family should be bombed. Really not a productive way to go. And in this case, Sway has actually just blocked the message outright. Let's instead have Nick say, are you kidding me? They're dropping 2,000-pound bombs on schools. Now let's have Simon say, have you considered why they might do that? And at this point, Guide has come in again. So Guide says, Nick, I understand you're passionate about this, and asks, could you share a specific incident you're referring to and its impact? And hey, Simon, let's avoid leading questions. Instead, let's focus on sharing each other's perspectives and the reasons behind our views. So let's have Nick now just directly respond to Guide. Nick says, well, one thing that would help is if America recognizes the Palestinians' right to the land. These specific incidents don't really matter. The fact is 40,000 Palestinians have died, many of them innocent women and children. Now let's have Simon ask, why do you think the Palestinians have a right to the land? How can you ignore that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people? Now let's have Nick say, well, it wasn't until 1948. Maybe we need some historical context here. And at this point, Guide has come in. So Guide says, it's good to see you both engaging with each other. Let's dig deeper into the history. And now Guide asks Simon, could you explain what you believe gives Israel a stronger claim to the land, particularly in light of the pre-1948 history? So both users are being relatively civil right now. I want to show you another cool feature. Let's have Simon say, hey, Guide, can you please give us some info on Jewish history in the region? And Guide has come in right here. Here's a brief overview of Jewish history going back to 1000 BCE. Guide is extremely versatile. You could also ask Guide to clarify confusing points, dig deeper into the arguments, summarize what's been said so far, and a lot more. There's one last feature we want to demonstrate, and that's the comprehension quiz that students complete at the end of each discussion. The quiz is generated from the students' chat transcript, so it can measure how well they understood each other. The deeper discussions go, the more nuanced the questions become, especially about the logical flow of the discussion. For example, one student might be asked about how the other student replied to an objection. Now you'll see on the right side that it's asking Nick questions about Simon's views and reasoning, and it'll ask Simon questions about Nick's. This quiz serves several purposes. It encourages active listening, it helps identify any misunderstandings, and provides a quantitative measure of how well the users are engaging with opposing viewpoints. Obviously, we could go much deeper, and that's what participants in our experimental studies do. They complete pre- and post-tests, and they typically chat for about 30 minutes. When they're done, we ask them to share their thoughts. And in our studies, we've had people disagree about everything from January 6th and the 2020 election to trans athletes in women's sports and Israel-Palestine. And what we're seeing in our studies is that, surprisingly, discussing today's most toxic, most polarizing issues on Sway can actually open people's minds and maybe even make them hate each other a little bit less. Both before and after their AI-guided discussions, participants rated how strongly they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements designed to measure their openness to opposing viewpoints. On every statement, the overall effect was a statistically significant shift in the direction of more openness. Here we see ratings of the statement, I feel like I can understand people who disagree with me about this topic. After a 30-minute Sway discussion, nearly half of the participants gave higher ratings to this statement, and only 14% felt like they had less understanding. Next, we see participants' ratings of the statement, "People who disagree with me about this topic have well thought out reasons for their views." 61% of participants agreed more strongly with the statement after their sway chats, and that's more than twice as many who moved in the opposite direction. And finally, looking at the scale as a whole, we see that 2/3 of participants had higher scores after chatting with an opponent on sway, while only 1 in 5 had lower scores. This change was highly statistically significant, and at 0.3 standard deviations, it's also meaningfully large. We expect these results to deepen and become more ingrained after repeated discussions on sway, and this is a hypothesis that we're going to test in our RCT.